Hello and welcome to CounterPunch Radio. My name is Eric Draitzer. Thanks so much for tuning in, coming back to the show. First time listeners finding the show, welcome aboard. Always happy to have you. Been a few weeks since I was able to put out a podcast, scheduling and life and all of these other things getting in the way. But here we are, so much important stuff to talk about. But before we do, let me do my song and dance for CounterPunch, the hawking of our proverbial wares. CounterPunch Plus, that is our subscriber section. You can get your subscription and support CounterPunch that way. You'll have access to all of this great content, all of the columns that used to be in the print magazine, plus the archives of more than 25 years of great stuff, a lot of stuff every day on the website, every week, new content going up on CounterPunch Plus, including hopefully in the future, some more stuff from me. So please do support CounterPunch in that way. CounterPunch Plus subscription is the way to go. If you like some of my stuff, you can also follow me on Patreon, patreon.com/Eric Draitzer. Lots more videos, geopolitical analysis, commentaries, and so forth. All right, let me turn to my guest today, somebody who I've literally been meaning to have on this show for probably 3 or 4 or 5 years now, and for whatever reason, it just hasn't happened. And here we are, it's happening. Abby Martin is with me. Abby Martin, you may or may not know. If you don't, she is the creator and host of The Empire Files. She is a co-host of Media Roots podcast with her brother Robbie, former guest on this show. She's a filmmaker, excellent film we'll talk about, Gaza Fights for Freedom. The websites, theempirefiles.tv, gazafightsforfreedom.com, and abbymartin.org, at Abby Martin on Twitter. Abby, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much for having me, Eric. It's a huge honor to be on.
Oh, stop it. It's perfectly okay and ordinary for you to be on here. Abby, I've been meaning to have you on for a long time, and so I don't know where we should begin because you and I have somewhat similar trajectories in how we got to making media and podcasts and so forth, really coming out of the anti-war movement and anti-war politics that kind of shapes our worldview. So I want to really focus on anti-war issues and imperialism. And really, I think that is the broadest issue we can start with. The empire. Your show is called The Empire Files. We live in the heart of the empire, and we are witnessing what I think is a momentous transition in the way that the empire is administered. How do you read the move from Trump to Biden?
Well, Trump, I think that we can all agree that people were wary, the establishment was wary about Trump becoming the CEO of the empire, mostly because he was completely unpredictable. I think he proved to be a very loyal servant to the ruling class. That's proven by the ridiculous tax cuts that he passed for the ultra wealthy. But of course, he also served the bipartisan foreign policy establishment quite well. For all the talk about accusing him of being a Putin puppet, I mean, he actually was not at all subservient to Russia. In fact, he did a lot of crazy stuff when it came to that area of the world, lobbying NATO partners to spend more money, sanctioning Russia for the annexation of Crimea. And the list goes on there. But I mean, in every region of the world, Trump pretty much ramped up US militarism and empire, doubled civilian casualties because of his increase in bombings around the world, increased drone strikes 300%, told the Pentagon to take the gloves off, literally just gave them carte blanche to do whatever they wanted, didn't even really want to be asked what they were going to do. Dropped the largest non-nuclear bomb ever to be dropped, the Moab, the mother of all bombs on Afghanistan. It was a pretty sadistic foreign policy, and that was clear from the get-go. When Trump was running his campaign, he spoke out of both sides of his mouth because he's a con artist, and that's what con artists do. So he was speaking to this fake notion of a populist right wing, this isolationism that people think, they think that there's this anti-war current with the right wing. We all kind of know that that's a farce, but he was speaking to that crowd and also at the same time speaking in pretty clear terms about wanting to escalate the wars so that he can win the wars. And that included beheading our enemies, that included carpet bombing people, killing terrorists' families. He was, it was pretty disgusting, the stuff that he was saying. So I think that when Trump came in, his whole modus operandi was like, I'm going to increase the bloodlust and just the violence perpetrated by the US war machine in a very open fashion so that we can win these wars, these wars, and finally like bring our troops home. And that's exactly what he did. He stayed true to his word. He bombed the shit out of them. And of course, emboldened all of these generals that he surrounded himself with. And everyone the entire time, Eric, I don't know if you got this sense during his administration, but I'm breathing a sigh of relief because now we can all unify in our shared hatred of the president again. Because for the longest time, people were bending over backwards, apologizing for Trump and literally like believing his con artistry, saying, oh no, he wants to bring the troops home. Oh no, he wants to do this. He just can't. He's prevented from John Bolton. It's like, okay, well, he appointed all of these people that now you're saying are preventing him from actually doing the things that he can do with the signing of a piece of paper. I mean, he was the executor. I mean, he could have brought the troops home in a day if he really wanted to. So that aside, Trump really was a perfect CEO for the empire. I think that he was too belligerent at times, and he was too unruly, and he did things a little bit sloppy. We see Chris Murphy, that Democratic senator, who pretty much spelled it out when it came to Venezuela. He just said we agree with his policy, but he didn't do it slickly. I'm paraphrasing, but so Biden, of course, I think he is more predictable, and he can mask his warmongering. Of course, just like the good old neoliberal doctrine, you just mask it in humanitarianism, and people don't really take a second glance. And Biden's entire foreign policy cabinet, they stemmed from these warmongering think tanks funded directly by the war machine, defense contractors. I think one third of his Pentagon transition team was funded directly by like CSIS and CNAS. Really, really crazy think tanks there in DC that are shaping some of the worst foreign policy maneuvers that we're seeing. And his whole platform is to reposition our foreign policy to isolate China and Russia now. So this great power, global power competition doctrine, or whatever the hell it's called, to essentially focus on these two nuclear powers, and it's a really scary thing. And it really just comes back to building up these imperial alliances. Because Trump, of course, they claimed was this isolationist. They hated his foreign policy, and it always like kind of came from the right? Like they said, you're writing love letters to dictators and all this shit. It's like, dude, he's doing exactly what you guys want. It's insane that you're actually criticizing him for things that, like the talking to Kim Jong Un and like not going hard enough against Putin or whatever. So the fact that Biden is already navigating um, toward China and Russia is just a really, really bad sign. And we can get into obviously the policies, but yeah, I mean, the foreign policy cabinet that Biden's resurrected has come essentially just directly from the Obama era, and some key foreign policy players are directly implicated in some of the largest scandals in the last 10 years: the torture scandal, the invasion of Iraq, and the war in Libya. So really bad signs all around. But Eric is the most diverse cabinet in the history of this country. And let me tell you, some real nice people packed in there. So I feel real good about it. I've just been at brunch every day, all day, because we're back, baby. America is back.
I feel good about it. I'm riding high. But the question is, from a broader analysis, I guess, of what Biden means. How does Biden prosecute imperialism? What I mean to say is the Biden administration administering a dying empire, and they know it? Or are they continuing to labor under the illusion of a unipolar global order where the United States remains the primary mover and shaker?
I think it's a good question. It's hard to imagine that people at this point can't see the US as a dying empire, considering that we are a completely failed state. The COVID rates are rampant, homelessness is out of control. The fact that 8 million more people have plunged into poverty just in the last 10 months. I mean, yeah, the signs are all there, right? The fact that you could go on and on about how exceptionally horrible we are compared to every other industrialized country. So it is perplexing that anyone with wide eyes, not behind rose-colored glasses, cannot look at this as a dying empire, right? And I think the last gasp is throwing just so much money, eh, just beefing up the military machine year after year. And I mean, I don't know. It's a good question. I think that when you look at people like Robert Kagan, and you look at the brand of neoconservatism that he represents, and you look at people like Tony Blinken, who's the new Secretary of State, they do believe that the U.S. is the bastion of freedom. I mean, I think they really do believe that if the U.S. weren't on top, and I hear this argument from a lot of people that if we weren't the empire, China or Russia would take its place. So it has to be someone, right? So it might as well be us because we're the good guys. And you look at the Sam Harris argument, because we have good intentions, it doesn't matter what happens as a result of those good intentions. At least we have good intentions. And I think it's exactly why we're seeing these foreign policy shifts against Russia and China to isolate them and build up our junior collaborators, the NATO alliances, so we can just continue to try to reassert ourselves as the dominant force in the world. And you're going to see a lot of dirty actions to try to delegitimize and economically weaken these two main competitors. What do you
Yeah,
think?
a lot of good intentions buried in shallow graves all over the world, really. I think that what you're saying is correct because basically what we're looking at here is not just a dying empire, but a growing recognition that we are past our peak, right? That there is that we're only headed downwards. I've seen that more and more from various publications, and I think that unfortunately the road that we're headed down in terms of our dying empire is one towards right wing fascist type politics more than it is anything productive or positive. But with that in mind, I want to focus, since we kind of started out with this very broad question, I want to focus in a little bit more, if we could, and talk about one of the countries that I know you've done some work on recently, Yemen. And Yemen has come into the news recently with President Joe Biden's, just still a strange phrase to say,
I
President
know.
Biden's comments about stopping U.S. aid for so-called offensive operations in Yemen. That is to say, aid to the Saudis for offensive operations in Yemen. So, my question to you is: first of all, how do you read this policy shift, and what, if anything, is really changing here? Is there a substantive change? Is this window dressing?
Yeah, and I want to preempt this by saying there's something that's just really disturbing about the passing off from between Democrat and Republican administrations. The fact that Obama, took over from Bush and actually expanded the empire, expanded drone wars and, the Libya bombing and all of that. And Trump takes over and increases sanctions around the world to genocidal levels. Tens of thousands dead in Venezuela, malnutrition found in Iranian children for the first time in decades. Just real sadistic stuff. Not to mention, of course, the drones increased 300%. So as Biden is now taking back over from Trump, no one in his administration is actually talking about reining any of this back. It's just a given that you will be inheriting this expansive war machine that Trump belligerently oversaw disgusting atrocities around the world. And there's absolutely no discussion of it whatsoever. And you can see that with the Iran negotiations. He's now using Trump sanctions as a bargaining chip instead of apologizing for what the past administration did. So that's a trend that is very disturbing and not talked about enough. It just continues to grow. Looking at Space Force, Jen Psaki just said she's really excited about Space Force. This is not a joke. Space Force is a really dangerous thing. Not only is it siphoning billions of dollars to create this absurd new agency, but it's also violating multiple treaties and starting a new arms race. Like, the hell's going on here? So to Yemen, yeah, I mean, this was one of the few policy shifts that I think that we were all expecting under Biden, because not only did he have key players that were discussing openly that wanting to end the offensive support for the war in Yemen, the U.S. backed war, but also Biden himself talked about this a lot on the campaign trail. We know that this was vetoed by the Trump administration. Trump's last acts, one of his last acts was actually expediting weapons sales to the Saudi coalition that's bombing Yemen. So I think that everyone was very hopeful. And plus, the anti-war movement has been focusing on Yemen for the last several years because it is the largest humanitarian crisis in the world, Eric. We know how devastating the situation is. I don't need to belabor that point. So when Biden made that giant foreign policy speech on February 4th, we were, listening with open ears. Okay, what exactly are you going to do about Yemen? And he had very important caveats and very strategic keywords that he used in his speech that I think spell it all out. When you look past the headlines saying, yeah, we're ending US support for the war, what does this really mean? So Biden said an end to offensive support. So offensive can, if you're looking at defensive, that's exactly the justification that Obama Biden got into the Yemen war in the first place to defend Saudi Arabia, right? And to defend their border. The entire war was structured around the logic of defensive operations. So when you're announcing an end to offensive operations, what exactly does that mean? What exactly is offensive versus defensive? Because it's not just the bombing from US arms companies that were selling the Saudi coalition. It was actually logistical, tactical support for targeting the rebels on the ground and training Saudi troops. So all of that, you can look at the Pentagon's language. I'm sure that they can paint all of that as somehow defensive to protect our strongest quote unquote counterterrorism partner in the region. So Tony Blinken actually said that we will still be offering support for counterterrorism measures from Riyadh and elsewhere. So I have not heard any specifications of what exactly is considered offensive versus defensive. And here's the other clincher: relevant arms sales are ending. Relevant arms sales, not all arms sales. So, what exactly is a relevant arm when it comes to this genocide that the U.S. has been backing? It becomes pretty clear that the arms will continue, Eric, and I don't know how the US is going to track which missiles are sent to be dropped on poor Yemenis. It seems like this is just window dressing. Sadly, I wish I were wrong, but unfortunately, there has been no clearly defined specifications of what exactly this means and how it is any different than what we've been seeing. And Tony Blinken said that they're lifting that terrorist designation for the Houthis. There's a lot going on. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
There's a lot going on there. That's what you just started saying what I was about to say. There's a lot going on in what Biden said, and it's not
Mhm.
just about ending support for offensive operations. The delisting of the Houthis as a quote unquote terrorist organization is a major move. Applauded by many people, but again, there's this question of why. What is the
Mhm.
real reason for why they would do this? Because I think we all understand that it's longstanding U.S. Well, I shouldn't say we all understand. Those of us who've been following Yemen understand that it's longstanding U.S. policy to see the Houthis as proxies of the Iranians. So why would you be delisting them at this point? It seems to me like what Biden really wants here and what the administration really wants is they feel that this whole war has been mismanaged and blundered by MBS and by the Saudis and by the Trump administration. And what they would like to do is get a hold of the reins, delist the Houthis, and manage a negotiation process rather than continuing to allow this thing to fester in an uncontrolled way. It sounds to me like managerial imperialism is back on the table here.
Yeah, I think you just spelled it out pretty clearly. That's exactly what we're seeing happen. And one other thing that Tony said, which I found interesting, is that he continues to assert that he is going to sanction the Houthis. So when you're talking about distributing urgent aid to millions of people who are on the brink of famine, I don't know how you're going to get around sanctioning 80% of Yemeni territory, but yeah, very managerial, especially since the U.S. has made it clear that they are not going to stop bombing Yemen themselves. I mean, we're still at war with the AQAP in Yemen, so it's kind of disgusting when you look at it. I mean, this is there are millions of people who are starving. We've all seen the photos; they are absolutely horrifying, and the fact that this is even happening in such a managerial fashion is just like really, really disgusting, Eric. And it really shows you that the anti-war movement. Let me say this: Biden oversaw, along with Obama, the entry into the Yemen war, right? And the fact that he is even trying to placate the anti-war community shows you that the anti-war community has been very successful in putting this issue at the forefront. And so it is a testament to the strength of activism and direct action against the U.S. involvement in this. So that is very big. And so we can't let Biden get away with pretending like something has changed. We need to keep up the pressure here, because clearly he knows that, the anti-war community is not going to let him off the hook. And I just hope that people really keep the pressure on.
Not to, I agree with all of that, and I certainly would never want to take away from the anti-war position here. But I have to raise a little bit of skepticism that Biden gives even a semblance of a fuck about what the anti-war contingent thinks. I think this is much more about the realist foreign policy camp, which sees Yemen as a disaster and which sees Saudi Arabia as a fledgling regional power that has now been eclipsed by Turkey and other countries in terms of influence, in terms of strategic necessity, and so forth. And so I think that from the Biden perspective, they see Saudi Arabia as becoming problematic when it comes to Yemen. And I think that's what this is really about.
Yeah, I mean, Trump certainly did no favors with that alliance. It was kind of ugly. The Khashoggi murder, the Lockheed Martin bomb that killed like 40 kids on that bus. I mean, there was a lot of scandalous stuff that made the Yemen war, you know, not palatable, I think, to a lot of people who are just like on the periphery. And maybe Biden just wants to address it. But yeah, I think that you're right. I think this has much more to do um, with Saudi and the region, as opposed to the strength of the anti-war community. But I did want to give some credit to the fact that at least people have been, like, people all over the place are doing direct actions to try to bring attention to this. And I think that, in part, that could be why they feel that they have to address the need to end this war, or at least address the urgent humanitarian crisis there. But yeah, I mean, Biden's an unmovable stone who clearly does not give a fuck about anything, and that's been crystallized with his lack of doing literally anything at all for people since he got elected. It's just like, what the fuck? It's like, dude, just give us the checks.
50, half a
like,
century, do something.
yeah, like what? And it's just like crazy. It's like he knows how much power he has. He's been a fucking senator for decades. Like, it's sick. He's such a right wing shill. It's not even funny. So yeah, we're gonna have to really mobilize uh, urgently, to build up some sort of resistance movement, Eric, that brings anti imperialism to the forefront, because these people can't wait.
Couldn't agree more. Absolutely. Before we go to the break, I want to just talk a little bit about this, obviously related issue of Iran. And we could do a whole show on just Iran. We don't have time to cover everything. But I would just note that a lot of people talking about Biden is sort of returning a sense of, sensible policy with vis a vis Iran. But I'm also skeptical of that because, number one, whether or not Biden wants to return the United States to the JCPOA, the nuclear deal with Iran. I'm not sure that the Iranians can come back to that deal at this point, considering the tremendous embarrassment to the Rouhani government with the US pulling out and the fact that the Iranians have an election this year and you'll have a new administration, potentially a hardliner administration, or certainly one that's going to be less willing to deal with the United States. So my question is, what do we make of US policy vis-a-vis Iran given 4 years of Trump and all of the damage that was done to even the, little bit of goodwill that the Obama administration had developed?
Yeah, this is another thing that has been completely disastrous. From day one, it was really clear that Biden was going to fuck this up in a major way. And a lot of his foreign policy cabinet were people involved in the secret negotiations. And that's actually what gave me hope going into this. I thought, well, at the very least, and I think that we can agree that there are major differences between Trump and Biden when it comes to domestic policy, perhaps, but on the foreign policy level, there aren't that many, beyond rhetoric. And when it came to Biden taking back the empire, I thought, okay, well, at the very least, we're going to try to renegotiate this Iran deal. Aside from the fact that, the Iran deal is stupid in the first place because it's the US dictating things that it should never be dictating. That needs to be said. But at the same time, I thought, okay, at least, these debilitating, crippling sanctions on Iran's economy can be lifted and we can start from scratch. And Biden, hopefully will do that because everyone was saying that was going to be happening, right? So, yeah, unfortunately, it's been the opposite. Like I said before, I mean, the 800 plus sanctions that Trump put on Iran alone, not being lifted whatsoever. And that is literally the only thing Iran is asking us to do. And Iran has tremendous goodwill. This is coming after Trump ripping up the nuclear deal, engaging in constant war games in the Persian Gulf, constant threats of annihilation, right? Like every couple months he would just like threaten the government on Twitter or whatever. Of course, the assassination of Soleimani and the assassination of Fakhrizadeh, a civilian, which of course the US was involved in. So all of these things Biden should take into account and hold a press conference immediately and just be like, we are so sorry for what Trump did. Can we start from scratch and actually engage in diplomacy? And you're not seeing that at all. Instead, you're just seeing them really put it at the bottom of their priorities list, wanting Iran to totally capitulate to the United States. Blinken is out there saying Iran is 3 months from a nuclear weapon. I mean, are you fucking Iran has never developed a nuclear weapon. They are not trying to develop a nuclear weapon. Of course, they are not adhering to the nuclear deal. Why would they? Why would they? Right? It's been 4 years of the US just completely violating every which way that the deal had laid out. It is absolutely sick, the imperial hubris and arrogance of the US empire to actually say Iran needs to concede, everything that they have, every single bargaining chip, every single piece of leverage needs to just be given up in order for them to even re-engage with the United States when the United States has been clearly the aggressor the entire time. It always has been. And so, yeah, I mean, Iran has even said, okay, look, let's have the EU involved with negotiating the terms. And the US just said no. The US just said, no, you need to go back and comply with the original deal terms before we even talk. Before we even talk. So, like you said, I mean, the fact that Iran has an election coming up in June, they've already done so much to avoid some sort of direct confrontation with the US. The fact that they strategically did not respond in the way that they obviously could have after the assassination of Soleimani was a strategic move on Iran's behalf. Of course, they don't want to get into warfare with the US, but they also don't want to be humiliated. They have to appear somewhat hardlined, right? And stand up for themselves. And so they are walking a fine line here. And it is going to be interesting to see what happens in the election because what the hell are the Iranian people thinking? I mean, it upsets me so much that Biden has reneged on the most basic and simplest foreign policy win that he could do. Like everyone wants this. I I would like to hear what your thoughts are, other than I think the most obvious, the elephant in the room, Israel really not wanting to re-enter the negotiations. And of course, they were initially done in secret, and Blinken has said that was a mistake. Now he wants Gulf allies and Israel involved in the new deal that they make. So it's a mess. It's a complete mess.
And the issue with Iran too is that it goes so far beyond the political because of the economic warfare that the US waged against Iran and continues to wage, which has all of these sort of knock-on effects throughout the various segments of society, things like shortages of medicine and inability to access international cash markets and make foreign currency transfers and things like that. These are very basic sort of aspects of people's lives, and Iran, of course, has this massive diaspora all over the world, millions of people living all over the world who are sending money and so forth. So Iran being shut out economically of the international financial transaction systems, and all of these and that's not even talking about the US and Israel waging cyber war against
Mhm.
Iran on a fairly regular basis, at least over the last decade or so. So there's a number of facets to this. And this, again, sort of brings me back to this idea that we're way far down the road now. We're so much farther than we were 5, 6, 7 years ago. And if you think the Iranians are going to walk in naive to any of this process, they're not going to.
Exactly. I mean, why would they trust anything that the US says at this point?
No reason. No
We'd be
reason.
incredibly lucky if they did want to engage in any sort of diplomacy. It's a miracle that they're even pontificating whether or not to engage with the U.S. It's a disgrace, man. And Biden is a disgrace. And again, like it's such an easy win for him. So it's baffling and dumbfounding why they are screwing this up so badly and mismanaging something that could just be, you know, again, like just a foreign policy win, and then he can move on and at least have that behind him. But he can't even do that.
No, he can't. All right, let's take a quick break. On the other side of the break, we'll continue our hop, skip, and jump around the global imperial chessboard. I want to talk a little bit about Afghanistan, this horrendous, ongoing, multi decade war crime that committed by the United States. We'll talk about that. We'll talk about Abby's experiences in Palestine and some issues related to that, and a whole lot more. Stick with us. We will be right back.
Somebody say that the war ended today, but everybody knows it's going still. Our motherlands and mother seas, here's where we believe it's simple. We don't wanna kill. Somebody say that the war ended today, but everybody knows it's going still. Our motherlands and mother seas, here's where we believe it's simple. We don't wanna kill. Oh, it's simple.
And we're back here on CounterPunch Radio chatting with Abby Martin. Of course, you're already visiting the Empire Files on YouTube and the website, but just in case you're pretending that you're not, the empirefiles.tv is the website. I would highly recommend you go check all of that stuff out. Of course, Abby's work is top notch, as you're hearing here in this conversation. So, Abby, Afghanistan, I teased it a little bit before the break. Teased is probably the worst word to use in this case, but I talked about it a little bit before the break. This sort of forgotten war, this just horrendous war crime that we've been committing for 20 plus years. We recently had some interesting developments, the announcement of decreased U.S. troop levels. But we also had an interesting report that you've talked about recently with regard to actual military and quasi military presence. So, talk a little bit about some of the new data on private mercenaries in Afghanistan and what this means about the evolving nature of U.S. imperialism.
Absolutely. So, of course, this is kind of in the background, Eric, just like the drone wars, right? In our post 9/11 dystopia, the Afghanistan war is a permanent war, and people have largely forgotten about it. And it is absolutely a war crime, and it continues to be a war crime. And the reasons for staying just keep evolving. I think when you're looking from an anti-imperialist lens, you can understand that essentially the reason that the U.S. wants to stay there is because they want to turn it into a neo-colony. They want to control the mining operations that are inevitably going to happen. As Karzai talked about, there's up to $3 trillion of mineral wealth in the ground. It also sits at a crossroads of giant global competitors. There's pipelines to be built there. And of course, the opium trade, which the CIA probably wants to manage as a black market product. So big pharma needs that opium. And right now, we're buying it. The big pharma is buying it from Turkey and India, and I'm sure they'd like to get their hands on the black market supply and control that. So there's multiple reasons why the U.S. military is still there. Otherwise, they would have gotten out a long time ago. I mean, there was no military quote unquote solution. I sound like Tulsi Gabbard, someone who's like, there's no military solution to this, therefore we should leave, instead of being like, people are dying. And there's like, you know, that was always funny about her anti-war angle. But yeah, I mean, I mean, what is there, where to even start with Afghanistan? I mean, Trump gets in there, doubles the amount of troops. You know, Obama oversaw this ill-fated troop surge that just was a complete disaster. Trump gets in there with the rhetoric that he's going to end the Afghanistan war. Everyone gives him credit for doing so the entire time. Meanwhile, he was killing more civilians than we'd ever seen since the invasion of Afghanistan. More US soldiers died under Trump than ever before. More Afghan civilians, more violence was seen on the ground. Of course, I mentioned the Moab was dropped. I mean, this was said to be dropped on ISIS caves. I don't, I never saw any proof of that. It had a blast radius of a mile. You had generals basically saying, we're not going to waste our time digging through dead bodies to count how many people actually died here. Just a bunch of crazy, horrific things happened under Trump in Afghanistan. And everyone was just kind of like, Trump's trying to end the war, right? He's trying to oversee this deal with the Taliban. The deal with the Taliban, when you look at the actual details of it, it had impossible benchmarks that, of course, the Taliban could never adhere to. It was meant as a complete facade. Um, Days after the last iteration of the deal was signed, the US bombed Afghanistan again. So the US has been continuing to bomb Afghanistan. The US, of course, is the one who's breaking whatever deal was made. And that was never done. So when Trump leaves office, everyone gave him credit being like, look, he wants to bring these troops home. And he did indeed remove, I think, like 2,500 troops, leaving 2,500 there. Of course, that does not mean that the CIA is gone. That does not mean the private contractors are gone. That does not mean the drones and the bombing is gone. We thought that Trump increased private contractors to 5,600, I think, during his term, which was a big deal because under Obama, even when there was tens of thousands of troops during the troop surge, there was only 5,000 private contractors. So that is a big deal that Trump did that. And we know that his big buddy, Eric Prince, founder of Blackwater, was lobbying to completely privatize the Afghanistan war. Let's get US personnel out of there. Let's America first, right? Let's focus on America at home and privatize the war and just have people from other countries or whatever doing the dirty work for us. So I never saw any of that plan come to fruition, right? And I just thought it kind of fell by the wayside until a couple weeks ago. After Trump leaves office, I saw a report that was reported in Stars and Stripes about private contractor numbers in Afghanistan that are now 18,000. 18,000 private mercenaries are in Afghanistan managing the occupation. Absolutely astounding numbers there. These people are fighting because when Trump was there, the number of private contractors that had died were actually double the amount of U.S. troops. So that really shows you what kind of warfare these people are engaged with. They're not just sitting fixing the Pepsi machine at the base; like they are out there doing shit that is getting them killed. So that kind of gives you an insight on the role of these private mercenaries, and the fact that there's actually 18,000 of them is astounding. It's astounding that no one's talking about this. And I think it shows you that we're in there for the long haul, Eric. Biden came to office basically promising an indefinite, the war to continue indefinitely. He said that he's going to maintain thousands of U.S. personnel there, and at the same time, he said, "Yeah, but we need to end the war." So you're just going to see the buck passed off from administration to administration, just like you've seen the generals, put forward saving face, just lying through their teeth about why they're there. And yeah, they get their big medals and they go off to their war profiteering gig after they leave their post in Afghanistan, and everyone wins except the Afghan people who continue to suffer under U.S. occupation for 21 years now.
I want to return to this point that we really should examine a little bit further about the sort of continuity of imperialism, administration to administration, and really not just a continuity, but sort of a growing, metastasizing process. But before we do that, I want to just ask you, and I mean, I realize you're probably speculating a little bit, but just whatever, do it. What do you think? What do you think is the actual reason for the negotiation, so-called negotiation with the Taliban? Why? If Trump is just this vicious monster, which he
Hmm.
is, and Trump doesn't actually care about Afghanistan, and yes, of course, we understand he wanted a political win, but is that really what this was about? I would argue, just personally, I
Hmm.
would say that this is again about China. The Chinese made tremendous inroads with the Taliban representatives in Doha for years. The Chinese were one of the only countries to have direct contacts with the Taliban. And I think there's a tremendous worry among the strategic planners in the empire that when the United States walks away from Afghanistan, it's going to be instantly a Chinese, the Chinese door flies open, and that's for mining, that's for energy, all those different sectors that the Chinese are interested in. So my question to you is, do you think that this is about Afghanistan, or is it much larger about a geopolitical chessboard here?
Yeah, I mean, I think that you just said it all. The fact that the U.S. knew that it needed to get it's basically its hand in the pie, officially, right? And these deals were actually being negotiated in secret during the Obama administration. So this was something that was happening a while before Trump even, tried to take credit for it. But I absolutely think you're right. I think that they knew that they needed to have the facade of doing something to negotiate peace, while at the same time ensuring U.S. domination in the country and the region at large. And at least the last deal that I saw did exactly that. It basically made sure that there was a continuing U.S. presence in the country, and that the U.S. has basically had first dibs, with whatever puppet it's working with, managing Afghan affairs. So yeah, absolutely, this is again going back to regional domination.
And the other interesting thing about Afghanistan recently is this Afghanistan kind of demonstrating a tendency that we've seen in other countries. Iraq is the one that comes to mind specifically, that even the handpicked U.S. puppet eventually turns against the United States because he knows what the United States is doing. If you read some of the statements from Hamid Karzai, who's now the former president of Afghanistan, who very much was a U.S. puppet for a large part of the time that he was in power there. I mean, Karzai is talking about the United States like it's the great Satan. You know what I mean? I mean, so you have this incredible 20-year period of the United States occupying Afghanistan, and yet just it's just waiting to get out of the U.S. Orbit.
Yeah, exactly. Well, we are the great Satan.
But I think that we have to keep in mind Afghanistan because, like I said at the beginning of the question, this is one of these ongoing war crimes that sort of sits on all of our heads, just like Iraq does. Iraq was years of war crime upon war crime upon war crime, and that's really what Afghanistan is. And so, to the fact that we, almost every year have to sort of have an article about Afghanistan, the forgotten war, I think that tells you something about the nature of imperialism in this time.
Yeah, the fact that for the first, like, several presidential debates, no one asked about the longest US war that was still going on, and it just wasn't even a question. And finally, when it was a question, it was absolutely incredible what Biden did in response. The woman who, she articulated this very long, intelligent question about how Biden was part of the failed troop surge. And, the Afghanistan papers came out and showed that they were just putting a face on just a big lie and this loss that was continuing for no reason. And Biden just like blankly looked at her and he was like, Afghanistan? He like had no, he just like couldn't even comprehend what she was saying. And she was like, yes, sir, Afghanistan. And he was like, oh, I didn't, it's just like, dude, I mean, it's I don't even wanna go the route of being like he's losing his mental faculties, but at that moment, I was just like, "This man is going to be so easily puppeted." And when you look at, like, Obama's best traits of pushing back against some of the, Russia-phobes and the Victoria Nulands and stuff like that in his latter half of his term, Biden is not going to be able to do what Obama did. He is going to be much easier to puppet from kind of these dark forces that he's surrounded himself with. So it's yeah, that question though, I was just like, dude, this is a bad scene.
I think that's an understatement. Yeah, it's a bad scene. It's a bad scene we got. All right. I want to talk about another well, another bad scene actually. The horrendous the horrendous reality that you witnessed in
Mm,
Palestine when you were there. Um I want to just before we talk about the film, I want to talk a
mhm.
little bit just about your experience in Palestine, what that was like, what I mean, obviously what you learned, but I mean, what really sticks with you? What sort of is seared into your brain after going to Palestine?
Oh man, I mean, Eric's, as people who've been involved in this movement for a while, Palestine is one of those issues that really is part and parcel to anti-imperialism because it's really the same struggle, same fight, and Israel is this battering ram for the US empire in the Middle East and kind of a garrison. Um, and a lot of people think it's the other way around, which is completely false. But I think before I went there, I still, even though it's like you see the map and you know the situation and you know how far it has gone, some part of me still wanted to believe that there was like some way out of the whole one state thing. And it sounds naive, right? Because even though I was advocating that there was no hope for a two-state solution and that, one state with equal rights for all, I think there was still a part of me that just didn't understand until you go and see the complete atomization of the West Bank and you realize there is no land left. There is no like state left for Palestine to even have. And so the only solution really is to have an equal state with rights for all. And I think the severity of the occupation, of course, you can't know until you're there. You don't really understand the refugee camp situation. You hear, of course, Palestinians live in refugee camps in the West Bank, and that Gaza is this warehouse for refugees. But until you're there, and I stayed in Balata refugee camp, and it was absolutely horrifying because Israeli troops come in and invade these refugee camps several times a week just to terrorize the civilians living there, shooting actual bullets, rubber bullets, tear gassing everyone. People die frequently from just suffocating on tear gas in these camps. And they are so overpopulated. I can't even imagine the situation with COVID right now. It's pretty harrowing to say the least. So, just the brutality of the occupation and the reality of how devastating it is for Palestinians to be living day to day. I remember driving in a car because, of course, settlers have settler plates, and it's a very visceral, apartheid. in terms of the roads just for settlers and the cars and plates just for settlers. And so I was in a car with Palestinians, and of course we're pulled over with little kids that look like they're fucking 19 with giant AKs. One of them's American. I'm like, okay, dude, why are you here? Um, and they, they just have their finger on the trigger, and they're just like, why, like, are you being kidnapped by these Arabs? And I just like, I had a nail file in my purse, and I knew that they could construe this nail file as a weapon, and they can send these kids to prison that I was driving in the car with. And finally, when they let us go a half hour later, after I like almost pissed myself, the people that we were driving with, they're just like, yeah, this happens to us every day. And yeah, we actually just got out of prison for like something that was just like very similar to what I was fearful would happen that night. I remember another time being at a funeral. A farmer, was just arbitrarily shot in the back and killed by an IDF soldier. And we were at the funeral for him, and his family was there grieving. His wife was wailing. It was very, very traumatizing. And as we leave the funeral, IDF had surrounded the house and were shooting rubber bullets and tear gas to terrorize the funeral goers. So just stuff like that, that is just so beyond the pale of what I think people even understand, when they, just abstractly understand Palestine living under occupation. It is really, really intense and very horrifying. One other quick story: we were at a main checkpoint, Calandia checkpoint, leaving the West Bank, and an elderly Palestinian man was walking up. There's signs everywhere saying, turn around, whatever, but they're in Hebrew. And so this man was walking up with his hands raised, clearly unarmed, and we were in line in the car waiting to go through the checkpoint, and IDF soldiers just started spraying bullets at the guy, and they were ricocheting everywhere. We all ducked down in the car. Mike said, "Get down. We're gonna get fucking killed." This is speaking from someone who was an Iraq soldier who said that it was felt like Iraq, like just being in Palestine for the short time that we were, which was a month. And luckily, the guy didn't get hurt, but they sprayed bullets everywhere, could have easily killed him as well as several other people just as collateral damage. Dan Cohen, the person that was driving us that day, said previously, I think a couple of weeks prior, they had just executed a pregnant woman there at the checkpoint for the same reason, for her not, adhering to the sign. And then, of course, they always say that they found a knife. And so that was their reason and justification for killing this pregnant woman. So it was pretty intense and traumatizing. And I mean, there's so many more stories, but those are the ones that are seared into my brain forever.
And then can you tell us how the project that would become Gaza Fights for Freedom came together?
Yeah, when we were there, of course, we wanted to get into Gaza. Mike had already been there in 2009, bringing wheelchairs and stuff for the aftermath of Cast Lead. And I had all the proper press credentials. We had all the paperwork filled out, and I was told by Ron Paz, the underling of Netanyahu that oversees the press office, that I was a propagandist and not a journalist, and that I was also an enemy agent of Iran. Which I was like, oh, I thought I worked for Russia and Venezuela. Where did Iran come from? um, but needless to say, it was scary to be within 48 and be called an enemy agent by the Israeli government. And, basically, I was told that I was banned forever from getting into Gaza, which was a huge blow. I wanted to meet my friends and comrades there. I wanted to work with the journalists there. And, I wanted to document the devastation that's subsidized by US tax dollars, this apartheid criminal medieval siege and blockade of millions of people. So had been in contact with my friends there. I think that was kind of the start of just being, wanting to do something, knowing that I couldn't document it myself. So when the Great March of Return sparked off, which was really unlike anything that we'd ever witnessed. I mean, tens of thousands of people with bared chests going to just protest at the partitioned fence that separates them from their ancestral lands, that, they were going in the tens of thousands. Women led this contingent of people, and that one day, 60 people were gunned down in cold blood by snipers cowering behind sand dunes. It was one of the most egregious massacres of unarmed protesters in modern history. And we all know how the corporate media covered it. It was a disgrace. They made it seem like they went Well, they always make it seem like Palestinians are a death cult, but it was so grotesque, the corporate media coverage, and it was so one-sided. It never ceases to shock me when something like that happens. It's like, okay, well, how could they possibly apologize for Israel in this case? And they did. And so I had a meeting with the journalists that I was supposed to meet initially when we were in Palestine from the Council on International Relations there, and we talked about collaborating on an Empire Files project to depict what the Great March of Return really was. And Eric, I directed what interviews we wanted to get. When this footage came in, and it took months because of the blockade, we had to work around the electricity blockade, their internet blockade. They only had electricity and internet for a few hours a day. So this footage was trickling in, excuse me, for weeks and weeks and weeks. When I saw the quality of this footage, I was so blown away. I just said, we can't just make like an Empire Files episode about this. We have to do a documentary. And so Mike and I took the entire year off, fundraised super grassroots from small donors, and actually made a full feature-length documentary called Gaza Fights for Freedom. And it is a very, very important, I think, indictment of Israeli war crimes. And even though that may sound like, okay, well, we already know Israel's committing war crimes, it's all documented for you. Actual targeting, snipers targeting protected categories of the Geneva Conventions: disabled people, children, journalists, and medics. And it's all right there. And I just hope that eventually, when Palestinians get their day in court, this will be part of a long body of work that can help make their case to finally hold Israel accountable for its crimes. But that's how it all came together. And we focus a portion of the film on Razan al Najjar, of course, the first female medic to go and help the wounded on the field. It was a really, really sad story. And her mom didn't trust us because, of course, why would you trust just two American journalists doing a documentary about your daughter? And she was the first person to see the documentary, and we got her approval before we put it out, and she really liked it. So I feel like that's a badge of honor. But yeah, our producer there didn't even want to attach his name to it because he didn't want to be punished by Israel. And a lot of the people involved in the Great March were punished, and all the medical passes to go get treatment were denied, just as they just everyone was just punitively like denied treatment. And so there's so many amputees. It's hard to actually imagine what the fallout was from the march that actually went on for a year, and change. People were going out there diligently every single Friday, and then, eventually the news just stopped carrying unless a lot of people died. But it was an incredible thing, very symbolic. And of course, it was all sparked off by the moving of the embassy to Jerusalem, actually. So, that was a huge blow. And going back to Biden, he has said that he will not change that.
Well, your attempts to get into Gaza were not the only time in recent years that you've run afoul of the Israeli government. So, why don't you tell us a little bit about what happened with one of your speaking engagements, and I guess what we should probably call state repression directed by Israel against you and against people like you. So, talk a little bit about what happened and the lawsuit.
Yeah. So, um, a lot of people don't know that not Israel. A lot of people don't know that the U.S. Sometimes it's hard to tell the difference because Israel is our greatest ally and is such a great collaborator with the U.S. empire, such a good lapdog. But a lot of people don't know that dozens of states in the U.S. have passed anti-BDS laws. And what BDS is, if people don't know, it's boycott, divestment, and sanction movement against the state of Israel. This is the same kind of peaceful political movement that ended apartheid in South Africa. What anti-BDS laws are designed to do is to make independent contractors forfeit their constitutional rights in order to work in states like the state of Georgia. So Georgia is one of dozens of states that have passed these legislative measures that block people from sorry, I'm tired. It's past my bedtime. I can't imagine how tired you are, Eric, with two kids. that basically block people from being able to boycott the state of Israel, which is our constitutionally protected right to do. The Supreme Court ruled after the Montgomery bus boycotts in the civil rights era that political boycotts is constitutionally protected speech. Not to mention, of course, free speech is constitutionally protected, right? So I was slated to give a keynote speech at a media literacy conference in Georgia. Ironically enough, it was just supposed to be about media freedom. At Georgia Southern University. I was given this contract that said I cannot boycott the state of Israel if I want to be paid my $1,000 honorarium. I was totally floored. I knew about these laws. I had heard about, a speech pathologist in Texas having to given this contract and denying it. She was on Democracy Now. Um, and I was just completely shocked. I said, obviously, I'm never going to sign this. I've been advocating for Palestinians my entire journalistic career. Of course, I can't sign this. Of course, I can't forfeit my rights to work in Georgia and give this keynote address. So the entire conference fell apart. And what ended up happening is I just made the story public, not realizing that I could actually sue and challenge this law until CARE contacted me. The Council on American Islamic Relations contacted me and said, "Look, we can do something about this. We want to represent you." So I'm working with CARE and the Partnership for Civil Justice Fund, suing the state of Georgia, trying to overturn this unconstitutional law. It is a flagrant and blatant violation of our rights. It is the biggest free speech issue today. Pro-Palestine speech is directly being censored and suppressed by the state. That is actual censorship. All of these cries about cancel culture and conservatives bemoaning about cancel culture on college campuses, like Milo Yiannopoulos, Milo Yiannopoulos for being like booed when he gives a speech. No, this is censorship. This is censorship. The hand of the state blacking out certain speech, and it is coming down hard against Palestinians and Palestine activists. And that is exactly what happened to me. And I think it's important for people to realize this is literally anyone who wants to do any sort of work under a contract. You could be a construction worker, you could be a substitute teacher, any work whatsoever. If you are making $1,000 or over, you have to sign a pledge that you will never boycott the state of Israel. It is really, really out there stuff, man. And I think the vast majority of people, even if you totally don't agree with BDS at all, I think that you would agree that this is a completely unconstitutional law and it needs to be overturned. And the fact that these have all passed under the radar really shows you the lobbying force of the government, and the fact that all of this criticism of Israel is masked in accusations of anti-Semitism, because that's pretty much how these laws have passed on a local level. After I filed my lawsuit against Georgia, Netanyahu's press office tweeted the next day, or the next day after that, they tweeted, "Anyone who boycotts us will be boycotted." And then they followed up saying, like, "We've worked really, really hard to pass these laws, these anti-BDS laws in the US." And it's like, okay, wait, isn't that a direct admission of foreign interference in our democratic rights? And then Eric, I found out that a Georgia state legislature who pushed the state law testified at a hearing that the Israeli consulate, quote, asked her to introduce the amendment to the law to make my case moot. And the lawmaker actually appeared with her at a hearing. So she actually brought an Israeli consulate officer to the hearing to advocate to make my case moot, to change the actual um, cap. So they were trying to change it to $100,000. So, like, if, just to render my case obsolete or whatever and throw it out. So that is just unbelievable to me that they were openly conspiring with an Israeli consulate official, and not to mention Netanyahu's office themselves bragging about passing these laws in the US. And Eric, if this contract said you cannot boycott, like, this is the most ironic thing about it. You could boycott Georgian products, you could boycott US products, replace the word Israel with any other country, and talk about how cartoonish that would appear to people. But it just, like, accept it. It's just like, well, Israel's our greatest ally, so yeah. And I think a lot of people obviously don't read these contracts, but that's the story in a nutshell. We're still waiting for the result. It's all kind of slowed down because of COVID, but we did just get good news coming out of Arkansas a couple days ago that just knocked down their unconstitutional anti-BDS law, which gives me hope that any judge who has studied the Constitution will know that they need to throw this law out, Eric, and hopefully eventually it'll go to the Supreme Court so we can have a final verdict, because there's been mixed verdicts from several states.
Just to put a final point on that, I think one aspect of it, as you very eloquently stated, is that it is an obvious violation of our constitutional rights, of basic human rights, and so forth. But taking it another step, I think there's another way to look at it, and that is that this is a tremendously positive sign for those who are doing Palestinian solidarity work, because look at how hard Israel is trying to stop this growing consciousness. And that's what they're really afraid of. It's particularly among those under the age of 50 that they are particularly concerned about, as the truth of what Israeli fascism actually is, of what the apartheid state actually looks like, as that trickles out into the broader consciousness internationally and even in the United States, and particularly, it must be said, among young American Jews who are increasingly rejecting Zionist orthodoxy in terms of politics and so forth. So your case is actually, I would say, part of a broader struggle that is, on the one hand, about defending rights, but on the other hand, this is the forefront of the Palestinian solidarity movement. It is the growth of consciousness of what this issue really is.
Well said, Eric. I couldn't agree more. And I think that Israel's running scared because before they were able to completely lock down the narrative, but with the eruption of social media and Palestinians being able to film for themselves and reveal the criminal occupation firsthand to the world, public opinion has shifted dramatically on this. And you can look at something like the anti war movement during the Iraq War buildup 15 years ago, and pro Palestine solidarity was not welcomed. Largely, there was a huge split in the anti war movement. They said this was not the same struggle. They didn't want pro Palestine messaging with anti war, anti-Iraq war messaging. Now, I would argue it's the opposite. You are not welcome in anti-war circles if you are not pro-Palestine, and you are seeing droves of young Jews walking off birthright, exposing birthright for the propagandistic conditioning that it really is. And that is very, very encouraging, inspiring. And you're right. I mean, people all over the world, I would say, have already woken up to this. Americans are kind of the last to wake up to a lot of this stuff, even though our government's directly sponsoring it and subsidizing these things, and we are the children of the empire. Nonetheless, American opinion polls have shifted dramatically as well, and I think that that's why you saw someone like Bernie Sanders, who just 4 years ago in the 2016 election could barely muster condemnation for Israel after the carpet bombing of Gaza in 2014. And now, during his campaign, most recently, he constantly talked about Palestine. He was actually going farther than any other candidate as a Jewish man, saying he wanted to leverage aid. He wanted to uh, remove the settlements to the 1967 borders. I mean, that was pretty serious stuff. And again, I think it's a testament to the strength of the Palestine solidarity movement and how much that movement has pushed the narrative in general to force at least rhetorical concessions or condemnations from a lot of these politicians. I mean, Netanyahu hasn't done it any favors either. He's been so blatantly fascist and right wing. And I think the Democratic field had a big problem because they couldn't explain away why they hated Trump so much, but Trump was so goddamn close with Netanyahu to the point where he was like using him for his reelection campaign and stuff. So that was like a problem for them. So Biden will be much better, I think, with the Israel alliance now. But yeah, I mean, absolutely, the Palestine movement has been growing dramatically, and it will not stop, because once the consciousness is open there, you can never look away again. And it all has to come from pressuring this government. We all know that it's coming from this government, because as many times as the United Nations or the ICC or whatever these international bodies, they're already on that page where they want to hold Israel accountable. And the U.S. will not let them do it. It has veto power. It continues to, basically threaten other UN members if they want to hold Israel accountable at all for any of these atrocities. So it really, again, has to come down to American citizens pressuring this government and doing things like this, getting involved in Palestine solidarity causes and linking up with like-minded organizations to really put Palestine liberation at the front and center here, um, because that's what's needed in order to really end apartheid once and for all.
Couldn't agree more. We're over the time, but I'm gonna just throw one last thing at you, Abby. If you take it in whatever direction you want, but I think that one of the main, overriding issues and ideas that I try to focus on is what you might call imperial continuity, right?
Mhm.
Continuity from one administration to the next. The fact that when we're talking about imperialism, that it is a system. It is not dependent upon one particular administration. It is a system, and in fact, it is a system with enough flexibility and wiggle room to actually have divides and conflicts within its own ruling class and ruling establishment. But the continuity remains, and so one of the things that is so troubling about watching this devolution of the United States and of the empire is just the fact that things seem to only get worse and worse when it comes to imperial power. Right? If you go from Bill Clinton and all of the disastrous policies, and then you carry that forward to 9/11 and Bush and the Patriot Act and the National Defense Authorization Act and all of these different things that have sort of formed the architecture of the surveillance state, the architecture of the police state that we all live in now. And then Obama just built that out further and capitalized on it and weaponized a lot of these things and did it to his own ends. And then you have Trump, who is even more vicious and who does it in his own way, and of course dismantles many institutions that are actually functioning within the state. And now we move to Biden. And so what I'm getting at here is a process of one building on the next, right? That what we have is a system in which the figurehead, the leader of the ruling class, is merely a representation of the growing power, or maybe we should say the degenerating power of the empire and of the state.
I mean, I think that you just wrapped it up pretty profoundly right there. I don't know what I could add. I totally agree with you, and it is just very disturbing to understand that truth, that the empire continues to grow, it continues to expand. It doesn't matter which administration is running it, Democrat to Republican, Republican to Democrat. As we mentioned before, Obama oversaw dramatic escalations and Trump oversaw dramatic escalations of that. And now Biden's re inheriting the empire and not talking about reining any of it back. And so we're actually looking at a much bigger and much less accountable empire being run with Biden as the CEO, which is actually much more scary to me because again, he could be easily puppeted by people who have much more nefarious goals in mind. Um, and I think that's just the nature of imperialism. I mean, if you look back, you mentioned the unipolarity, right, of the world today and like the drive for the US to be the unipolar force. I mean, there was like different factions that were stronger. I think the Soviet Union being in play was a huge deterrent for the empire being as strong as it is. But I also think that it also has to do with the desperation of a dying empire and failed state at home, that you see it doing such egregious things around the world. The continuation of the war on terror, these drone wars. I mean, even someone like Bernie Sanders and so-called anti-war candidate Tulsi Gabbard didn't have anything to say about the drone wars. These things have been so conditioned and hammered into the American psyche as just necessary measures. And so all of this like discussion about the empire aside, it really has to come down to the education, the political education in terms of Americans. Because if we are just this willfully ignorant about what our government is doing in our name, nothing will ever change. I mean, it is pretty astounding how much we are removed from what our government is doing and the cognitive dissonance that reigns supreme in this country. And so I have to say that it really has to come down to learning what's going on in our names. But yeah, I mean, it's pretty crazy, Eric. I don't know how much worse it can get. I think that scarily. It can get a lot worse if we're really talking about warfare with Russia and China. But um, it just seems like genocidal maniacs are at the helm constantly. Mike Pompeo being this crazy uh, religious zealot who thought the rapture was around the corner. If we couldn't get any worse than that, but it seems like Tony Blinken um, isn't really differing when it comes to what's actually important. So, it's just window dressing on the same evil policies with the same nefarious intentions, and that is all wrapped up in the package of saying, well, we need to do it, Eric, because if we're not the empire, someone else much worse, right? Should the Chinese or the Russians will take our place, and we can't have that. So it's this bizarre justification to just commit endless crimes around the world. And what I hope people can link together, and this is the importance of like linking these struggles with an anti-imperialist internationalist lens, because Black Lives Matter everywhere. Brown lives matter everywhere. It doesn't just stop and start at the border of the United States. And we really need to understand that the US empire is a global thing. It's a territorial empire. Bases and military personnel are spanning the entirety of the planet, and millions, tens of millions of people are living oppressed, subjugated under the boot of US imperialism and militarism. And if we don't care about the people that extend beyond our borders, we're hopeless. And this really is an international movement, and it has to come from understanding the solidarity, right? And having solidarity for people who are living affected by the policies of this criminal government. So I don't, I just went off on such a long tangent, Eric, but I'm glad to talk to someone. It's very refreshing to talk to someone who really cares about these issues. And I think that more people are caring about this and becoming politically conscious about empire and imperialism and war. It seems like we're in this permanent war state, and it's hard to really break through. But I think that people, there's a change, especially with the anti-communism that's been the unofficial religion in this country for the last 100 years. I think for the first time in a long time, there's an opening and space for mass organizing to happen. And we just need to bring anti-imperialism into that, because that is the reason why we don't have healthcare, why we don't have anything in this country. All of our money is being siphoned into this global empire, dominating, tens of millions of people. And so if people really just understood that, and we can really build around that, I think there's hope.
I think that's the good note to end on. We want to end on a hopeful note. Abby Martin, thank you so much for, as always, helping us to pick our way through all of these complicated issues. If you are not already subscribing, you should be subscribing to the Empire Files on YouTube, the website, the empirefiles.tv. You can go check out the movie we talked about. GazaFightsForFreedom.com is the website, and abbymartin.org for all of her artwork and everything. Abby is one of the leading voices we have in the anti-war movement, and I'm very, very happy to have spoken with her. Abby, thank you so much for coming and chatting with us.
Thank you so much for having me, Eric. Keep up the great work.
You do the same. Listeners, thank you as always, and we will chat again real soon.